There's a rule among the roughest riders in the country. You don't touch her. Not because she's fragile, because the last person who tried is a story they still tell in low voices. So when a young black belt squared up in a roadside diner and demanded she fight him, the old bikers at the counter didn't jump up to help. They just waited, watching him, almost pitying him, because they knew something he was about to learn the hardest way a person can learn anything. Before we get into it, I want to know something. Where in the world are you watching from this morning? Drop your town, your state, your country down in the comments. This little corner of the internet is for people who still believe that kindness matters, that the quiet ones deserve respect, and that nobody should ever mistake a gentle soul for an easy target. If that sounds like you, you're already among friends here. So settle in, get comfortable, and let me tell you exactly what happened in that diner. Because to understand how a decorated young champion ended up learning the hardest lesson of his life over a cup of coffee, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand the woman in the corner booth, the one nobody in that room ever read correctly. And you have to understand that on that ordinary, rainy morning, not a single person who walked through that door had any idea they were about to witness something none of them would ever forget. So let's begin where it began. There's a rule among the roughest riders in the country. You don't touch her. Not because she's fragile, because the last person who tried is a story they still tell in low voices. So when a young black belt squared up in a roadside diner and demanded she fight him, the old bikers at the counter didn't jump up to help. They just waited, watching him, almost pitying him, because they knew something he was about to learn the hardest way a person can learn anything. She set down her coffee. She said one sentence, and everything he thought he understood about the world was about to come apart. To understand what happened in that diner, you have to understand her. And to understand her, you have to go back, not 30 years, but to an ordinary morning, in an ordinary town, where nobody looked twice at the woman in the corner booth. Her name was Dell, and by the time the sun came up over that stretch of highway, she had already been awake for hours. She was somewhere in her late 50s, though the years sat on her the way weather sits on stone, not softening it, but proving how much it had endured. Silver hair, pulled back plain. Hands that had clearly done more than their share of hard living. She moved slow, not tired slow, deliberate slow, the way people move when they've learned that hurrying rarely fixes anything worth fixing. Every morning, she came to the same diner, sat in the same booth, the one facing the door, though nobody thought much of that at the time. She ordered the same breakfast, eggs, dry toast, coffee black, and she knew the waitress by name, and the waitress knew hers. There was an ease between them, the kind that only comes from years of small mornings stacked one on top of the other. But if you were paying close attention, and most people weren't, you'd have noticed a few things that didn't quite add up. You'd have noticed that when Dell reached for her wallet, the waitress waved her off, quietly, like it was already settled, like it had been settled a long time ago. Dell always left money anyway, always more than the meal was worth. But she was never once allowed to pay the full price, and neither of them ever explained why. You'd have noticed the trucker 2 booths down glance up when she walked in, a big man, the kind who filled the doorway, and give her a small nod, and then immediately look back down at his plate, the way a person looks down when they've been taught that eye contact is a thing you earn, not a thing you take. And you'd have noticed her phone buzz against the table. Once, she silenced it without looking. Didn't glance at the screen. Didn't need to. Little things. Easy to miss. The kind of details your mind files away and doesn't understand until much later. Before we go further, this channel is for people who believe the quiet ones deserve respect, not a target on their back. If that's you, tap subscribe. The people who prey on kindness never do. Because to everyone in that diner, Dell was just a quiet old woman having her breakfast. And that morning, someone was about to make a terrible mistake about exactly who that quiet old woman was. She noticed the crying before anyone else did. That was the thing about Delaware. She sat facing the door, yes, but she saw everything else too. The whole room, in the quiet way that some people learn to read a space out of habit or out of necessity. And 3 booths over, near the window where the morning light came in gray and thin, there was a woman trying very hard not to fall apart in public. She was maybe 40, younger than Dell, but worn in a way that had nothing to do with age. Her coffee had gone cold in front of her. She wasn't eating. She just sat there with her hands wrapped around the mug like it was the only warm thing left in her life. and every few seconds she'd press her lips together and blink fast at the ceiling, the way people do when they're fighting to keep the tears from spilling over in front of strangers. Nobody else looked. That's how it usually goes. A room full of people, and everyone finds a reason to study their own plate. It's easier that way. Kinder to yourself, if not to her. Dell watched for a moment. Just a moment. And then she did something small. When the waitress passed, Dell said something low and slid a few folded bills across the table and nodded toward the woman by the window. Cover her meal, she said. Don't tell her who. And that could have been the end of it. An anonymous kindness, the kind that lets everyone keep their dignity. But then Dell did the harder thing. She got up. She walked over. And she sat down across from a woman she had never met. She didn't say much. She wasn't the type. She just told her, gently, that whatever it wasn't the end of the world, even when it felt like it. That she'd sat in that same seat feeling that same way more times than she could count. That some mornings the only thing you can do is get the coffee down and keep going. And that's enough. That's allowed. The woman, her name was Corinne, looked up like she couldn't quite believe a stranger had bothered. And something in her cracked open, the way it does when someone shows you a kindness you weren't braced for. She started to talk. Not all of it. Just enough. She said it was her son. That he was going through something. That he'd been so angry lately. Angry at everything. At her. At the world. And she didn't know how to reach him anymore. She said the word angry twice, and the second time her voice dropped, like she was a little afraid of it. Like it was bigger than she wanted to admit. Dell just listened. She didn't offer advice. She didn't try to fix it. She just let the woman say it out loud to someone who wouldn't judge her for it. And sometimes that's the whole gift. Then she stood, rested a hand on Corinne's shoulder for just a second, and went back to her booth. Asked for nothing. Expected nothing. It was the smallest thing in the world. One quiet act of decency for a stranger having the worst morning of her week. And it was about to cost more than anyone in that diner could have imagined. The bell over the door slammed. That was the first thing that was wrong. Everyone else came through that door easy, careful, the way you enter a place where people are trying to have a peaceful morning. He came through it like he owned it. Like the room had been waiting for him and was late. His name was Trace, and he was 23 years old. And he walked in already looking for something to be angry about. He was built for it, too. That was the thing you noticed first. The shoulders, the way he carried himself, the coiled readiness of a young man who had spent his whole life being told he was dangerous and had come to believe it was the best thing about him. He was a state champion, decorated, belts and trophies and a wall full of proof that he could beat other people. He'd trained since he was a boy, and somewhere along the way the training had stopped being about discipline and started being about winning. And then it had stopped being about winning and started being about needing to win. Needing everyone to see it. Because underneath all of that, and this is the part that matters, Trace was afraid. Not of any fight. Of something quieter. Of being small. Of being the kid whose father left, whose mother cried, whose whole world could come apart if he ever once stopped clenching his fists. He didn't have a word for it. So he called it strength, and he wore it like armor. And he went looking for places to prove it was real. And then he saw his mother. He saw Corinne at the window booth. Eyes red, cheeks wet, that unmistakable look of a woman who had been crying in public. And something in him went white hot. Not concern. Shame. The deep, ugly shame of a young man who couldn't stand to see his mother look weak, because her weakness felt like his own, and he'd built his entire self around never feeling that again. And then he saw the biker. He saw the silver-haired woman in the worn leather, sitting close to his mother just a minute before, a stranger who had been right there while his mom fell apart. And his mind, hungry for something to blame, did the math wrong. All wrong. He didn't see kindness. He saw a threat. He saw someone who'd upset his mother, or leaned on her, or worse. He saw an old biker he could handle, in a room full of people who'd watch him handle it. Hey! The word cut across the whole diner. Loud. Flat. Everyone flinched. Hey, you. What did you say to her? The quiet that Dell had built her whole morning around shattered like a dropped plate. Corinne's head snapped up. No, she started to say. No, honey. She was helping, but he wasn't listening. He was already moving toward the corner booth, chest out, chin up, and the whole warm and gentle world of that little diner tipped sideways into something with an edge on it. If watching a young man disrespect an older woman who did nothing but show kindness makes your blood boil, comment, not on my watch. Let's see how many of us are on her side. Because Trace had just picked a target. And he had picked, of every person in that room, the exact wrong one. He stopped at the edge of her table, close enough that his shadow fell across her plate. "Stand up," he said. Dell didn't. She reached for her coffee instead, wrapped both hands around it, and took a slow sip, like the boy filling the space in front of her was whether she'd decided to wait out. That only made it worse. Men like Trace can handle almost anything except being ignored. "I'm talking to you." Louder now. The whole diner was watching, and he could feel it, and he fed on it. "You think you can just sit here? You think I don't see you? Stand up, old lady." There it was. Old lady. He said it like a slap, like the two smallest, most dismissive words he could find, and he watched her face for the flinch that would tell him he'd landed the hit. The flinch didn't come. "I want to fight," he announced, to her, to the room, to himself. "Right here, right now. You want to get close to my mother? You want to play tough? Let's go. Stand up and let's go." And this is the moment. This is the exact moment the whole story turns on, though nobody watching would have known it yet. Because a challenge like that, thrown down loud in a crowded room, does something to a crowd. It should have made people nervous, should have made them look away, or reach for their phones, or pray it didn't spill toward them. That's what fear looks like in a diner at breakfast. But down at the counter, a few of the older men had gone still. 3 of them, weathered, quiet. The kind of men who'd been in and around rough places their whole lives and knew exactly what danger smelled like. They had turned, slowly, on their stools, and they were watching Trace. And they were not afraid. There was no fear in those faces at all. Not for Delegate. Something else was there instead, something that didn't fit the moment, something that would have made your skin prickle if you'd caught it. One of them set down his fork. Another shook his head, just barely, side to side. It was pity. They were looking at this strong, shouting, decorated young man, this state champion who thought he'd cornered a tired old woman, and every one of them looked at him like they were watching someone walk off a cliff he couldn't see. The question is, why? To answer that question, we have to leave the diner for a while. We have to leave Trace standing there with his fists half raised and his mother's mouth open in warning. And we have to go back, years back, decades back. Because the woman he was shouting at had a life behind her that he could not have begun to imagine. Dell hadn't always been quiet. There was a version of her, a long time ago, that the men at that counter still remembered. A younger woman on a motorcycle that seemed too big for her, riding into towns like this one at the head of a line of riders that made shopkeepers lock their doors and mothers pull their children inside. She had come up in a world that did not hand anything to women. Least of all respect, least of all authority. And she had taken it anyway, mile by mile, year by year, in a life that most people only ever see in stories they don't believe. She had ridden for more than 30 years. Think about that. 30 years on the road, through everything the road does to a person, in a world where the wrong word at the wrong moment could end you, and where trust was the only currency that mattered and the hardest thing on earth to earn. She had buried friends. She had carried others home. She had been in rooms where things went bad, and she had walked out of those rooms when others didn't, and somewhere in all of it she had become something that the men around her did not just follow but answered to. Because here is the thing that Trace, in all his shouting, could never have known. Dell didn't ride with the crew. Dell led it. Not a small crew. Not a soft one. The kind of crew whose name, spoken low in the right places, changed the temperature of a room. The kind of crew that other hard men stepped around. And at the front of it, for longer than most of them had been riding at all, was the silver-haired woman now sitting in a corner booth being called old lady by a boy who had mistaken calm for weakness. They had a word for what she was, though they rarely said it out loud. She was the one you called when something went wrong. Truly wrong, the kind of wrong that couldn't be undone. She was the name at the end of the phone. And when she picked up, men crossed state lines. They rode through the night. They came, no questions, because she had come for them, once, when it counted, and that kind of debt does not expire. Which brings us to the diner. Because Dell hadn't chosen this place at random. She hadn't wandered in one morning and simply liked the coffee. There was a reason the waitress waved off her wallet every single time. There was a reason the trucker 2 booths down had nodded and then looked away like a man who'd been taught where the line was. There was a reason this ordinary little diner treated an ordinary-looking woman like something close to sacred. And to understand it, you have to go back to a rainy Tuesday, years before any of this. It wasn't a famous day. Nobody wrote it down. But the people of this town never forgot it, and they never talked about it either. Not the way you'd expect. It lived in the kind of silence that gets passed from one person to the next, a thing everybody knows and nobody says. Back then, this stretch of highway had a problem. A bad one. There were men who'd taken an interest in the little businesses along this road. The gas station, the motel, the diner. Men who came around each month with a smile and an open hand and a promise about what would happen to your family if the hand went home empty. It's an old story. It happens in more places than anybody likes to admit. And the people here were ordinary people, working people, and they had no way to fight it and nowhere to turn, because the men who did this had made very sure of that. The woman who ran the diner back then, the mother of the waitress who now waves off Dell's wallet, was one of the ones being squeezed. She was close to losing everything. She'd stopped sleeping. She'd started keeping the lights on all night. And one gray, rain-soaked Tuesday, at the lowest point of it, a woman on a motorcycle pulled into the empty lot and came in out of the wet and ordered a cup of coffee and sat facing the door. She noticed the crying before anyone else did. Some things about a person don't change. She didn't say much. She wasn't the type. She just listened while a frightened woman told her more than she meant to. And then Dell asked one question. Who? And the woman told her a name, and Dell nodded and finished her coffee and left more money than the coffee was worth on the counter. And she rode away into the rain, and the woman figured that was the end of it. A stranger's sympathy. Nothing more. It was not the end of it. What happened after that, exactly, is the part nobody says out loud. But this much is known. The men with the open hands never came back. Not the next month. Not ever. Whatever conversation was had, wherever it was had once, and it was final. And the problem that had haunted this town for years simply evaporated, the way a bad dream does when you finally wake up. The people here got their lives back, their businesses, their sleep, and they understood, in the wordless way that towns understand things, exactly who had given it back to them. They never saw the crew. Most of them never even learned Dell's name. But they knew. And from that rainy Tuesday forward, there was a standing arrangement in this town that no one had ever written down and no one would ever break. That woman does not pay full price for anything. Not here, not ever. That woman gets a nod, and then your eyes go down, out of respect, the way you'd lower your eyes in a church. That woman is ours, and we are hers, and we will carry what she did for us for the rest of our lives. That is why the waitress waved off the wallet. That is why the trucker looked away. That is who was sitting in that corner booth, wrapping both hands around a cup of coffee, letting a shouting young man call her old lady. And now, maybe, you understand the faces of the men at the counter. Now you understand the pity. Because those three weathered men knew at least a piece of that story. They knew what she was. They knew what stood behind her, one phone call away. And they were watching a 23-year-old state champion square up against the single most dangerous person he would ever meet in his life. And they knew that nothing anyone said now could stop what he had already set in motion. The only person in that entire diner who didn't know was Trace. And he was still shouting. Back in the diner, none of that history showed on Dell's face. That was the strange, quiet horror of the moment, if you knew what you were looking at. Here was a woman with 30 years and a whole crew and a rainy Tuesday behind her, and she wore all of it like she wore that worn leather vest, comfortably, invisibly, without any need to show a single soul. She just sat there, both hands on her coffee, watching the boy the way you'd watch a storm you'd already decided to wait out. I'm not going to fight you, she said. Her voice was even, not scared, not angry, just plain, the way you'd tell someone the diner was out of a certain pie. I'm not going to fight you. 5 words, offered without heat, and then she lifted the cup again and took a sip. And that calm, was the worst possible thing she could have done to a young man like Trace. Because Trace didn't have a category for it. In his whole life, in every gym and every match and every schoolyard before that, calm meant one of two things. Either you were about to win, or you were too weak to do anything else. He couldn't imagine a third kind. He couldn't imagine that the woman in front of him simply had nothing to prove, because he had spent every waking hour of his existence needing to prove everything. So he read her stillness the only way he knew how. He decided she was afraid. He decided she was weak. And it made him bolder. You're not going to fight me, he repeated, and he laughed, ugly and loud, playing to the room. Of course you're not. Sitting there like you're better than everybody. You know what you are? You're nothing. You're a scared old woman in a costume. Corinne was on her feet now. Trace. Trace, stop it. But her voice barely reached him. He was somewhere else, somewhere with an audience, somewhere he needed to plant his flag. And then he crossed the line that could not be uncrossed. He reached down and grabbed her by the arm. Not gently. He wrapped his hand around her forearm, that trained grip, and he yanked, trying to haul her up out of the booth, trying to make her stand, to force the fight into existence because she wouldn't hand it to him. The cup went over. Coffee spilled across the table and ran off the edge and dripped onto the floor, and the whole diner made that small collective sound a room makes when something has gone truly wrong. She didn't fall. She didn't stumble. She came up out of the booth about halfway, on her own terms, and then she was still again, standing now, his hand still clamped on her arm. And here is the thing that should have warned him, the thing that should have frozen the blood in his veins if he'd had the eyes to see it. She wasn't struggling. He had a grip that could break boards, on the arm of a woman 3 decades older than him, and she was not pulling away. She was just looking at him, steady, almost patient, like a person waiting for a child to finish a tantrum. And in that stillness, there was something so much larger than fear that the men at the counter went a shade paler, because they understood what her stillness meant, even if he never would. And then she did one small thing. She turned her head, just slightly, and she looked, for one single second, at the door. That's all. One glance. She didn't call out. She didn't reach for a phone. Though somewhere in her pocket, that phone had buzzed once already this morning and been silenced without a look. She just glanced at the door, the way you glance at a clock when you already know what time it is, and then her eyes came back to Trace. If you weren't paying attention, you'd have missed it entirely. Trace missed it. He was too busy holding her arm and searching her face for the fear he needed to see and couldn't find. But that glance meant something. Hold on to it. Because the woman who had spent a whole quiet morning asking nothing of anyone had just, for the first time, looked toward the one thing in the world that could turn this room upside down. Somebody in your life needs to see how this ends. The person who always stays calm while some bully tests them. Share this with them. And if you think Trace is about to learn a lesson he'll never forget, you're not wrong. His grip tightened. Her expression didn't change. And somewhere out on the highway, though no one inside could hear it yet, the morning was about to stop being quiet for good. And then Corinne did something nobody expected. She put herself between them. This woman who, moments ago, had been crumpled in a booth crying into cold coffee. This woman who her son had walked in wanting to protect, or thought he did, stepped into the small, dangerous space between Trace and the woman he was gripping by the arm, and she put a hand flat on her son's chest, and she said his name in a voice he had never heard her use before. Trace, let go of her. Right now. There was something in it that stopped him. Not the volume. She wasn't loud. It was the fear. Not the soft, sad fear he'd seen on her face when he walked in. This was different. This was a mother who understood exactly how much danger her child was in, and it poured off of her, and even Trace, lost as he was in his own performance, felt it land. Mom, get back, I've got. You don't. Her voice cracked. You don't have anything. You have no idea. And then she turned and looked at the silver-haired woman, and her eyes filled up all over again, and she said the thing that turned the whole morning inside out. I'm sorry, Corinne said. To Delaware, I'm so sorry. I didn't know it was you when I sat down. I swear I didn't. And then you were so kind to me, and I couldn't find the words to. And Dell, who had not reacted to a single thing her son had done, went very still in a new way. She looked at Corinne's face. Really looked. And something moved behind her eyes, some old recognition surfacing from a long way down. Because Corinne knew her. Not from this town. Not from this diner. From before. From a life Trace knew nothing about. A life his mother had folded up and put away so that he could grow up ordinary and safe and never have to carry it. Corinne's husband. Trace's father. The man Trace believed had simply left. The absence Trace had built his whole angry armor around. Had ridden. Years ago. Before Trace was old enough to remember his face. And there had been a night. A bad night. The kind of night that Dell's crew existed for. When everything went wrong and a young rider with a wife and a baby at home was closer to the end of his life than anyone should ever be. And it was Dell who came. Dell who crossed the miles. Dell who pulled him out of it and got him home and asked for nothing. Because that was what she did. That was the whole shape of who she was. The same open-handed grace she'd shown a stranger crying at a window booth not 30 minutes ago. Trace's father had lived years longer than he was ever supposed to because of the woman his son was now holding by the arm. He was gone now. That part was true, the leaving, though it hadn't been the kind Trace imagined. And Corinne had carried this her whole life. She had raised her son on a careful, protective silence, and she had walked into this diner a wreck this morning because grief had ambushed her, and a stranger's small kindness had cracked her open precisely because she had felt, without understanding why, that she'd been in the presence of that kind of grace before. She hadn't known it was Dell. Not until Trace said the words "old lady" and she saw the vest and the silver hair and the stillness, and the whole floor of her world dropped out from under her. "That's her," Corinne whispered, to her son, to the room, to herself. "Trace, that's the woman who saved your father." And for the first time all morning, Trace's hand loosened on Dell's arm. He didn't understand it yet, not all of it. But he understood enough to feel the ground shift, to feel the story he'd walked in telling himself begin to come apart in his hands. And outside, on the highway, a sound was rising. It started as almost nothing. A low sound underneath the morning, out past the windows, so faint at first that you'd have taken it for a truck on the highway or a plane too far up to see. The kind of sound you feel in your chest before your ears fully catch it. Corinne heard it and went rigid. The men at the counter heard it and set down their cups. And Trace, still holding a loosening grip on Dell's arm, felt the whole diner change temperature around him without understanding why. The sound grew. It wasn't one engine. That was the thing that started to reach people, one by one, as the noise climbed. It wasn't one, and it wasn't two. It was many. A wall of them, low and rolling and getting closer, the deep synchronized thunder of motorcycles moving together in a way that no casual group of riders ever moves. This was formation. This was purpose. This was a sound that had an intention behind it, and everyone in that diner, even the ones who couldn't have told you why, understood on some animal level that the intention was arriving here. The waitress stopped where she stood, a coffee pot forgotten in her hand. The engines filled the parking lot. You could see them now through the windows, rolling in slow, headlights on in the gray morning, one after another, until there were more of them than anyone was counting, arranging themselves across the lot in a way that was almost ceremonial. And then, one by one, the engines cut out, and the silence that came after was so much louder than the noise. That's the part the people in that diner would talk about for years, on the rare occasions they talked about it at all. Not the thunder of the arrival, the quiet that followed it. Because a room full of people had just heard something enormous pull up outside, and now there was nothing. No shouting, no revving, no chaos. Just boots. The measured sound of boots crossing gravel, unhurried, coming toward the door in no particular rush at all, because men who are certain of themselves never rush. The bell over the door rang. It was such a small, ordinary sound, the same bell that had rung when Trace slammed through it. But this time nobody flinched at the door. They flinched at what came through it. They filled the entrance, and they kept coming, and they did not shout, and they did not threaten, and that was somehow the most frightening thing of all. They simply came inside, weathered and silent and enormous in that small warm room, and they arranged themselves along the walls, and they looked at exactly one thing. They looked at the young man holding their leader by the arm. Nobody drew anything. Nobody raised a hand. There were no words at all. There didn't need to be. The math of the room had simply, completely, and permanently changed, and every single person in it understood the new arithmetic without a syllable being spoken. A moment ago, Trace had been the most dangerous thing in that diner. The loud one, the strong one, the young champion with the trained grip. Now he was a boy in a room full of the answer to a question he never should have asked. He let go of Dell's arm. He didn't decide to. His hand simply opened. The way your hand opens when your body understands something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. He took a step back and found there was nowhere to step. He looked at the men along the walls, and then at the men at the counter who had risen too, and then at his mother's terrified face, and then, finally, helplessly, at the silver-haired woman he had spent the whole morning calling old lady. And she was looking back at him. She still wasn't angry. That was the thing. Through all of it, the shouting, the grip, the spilled coffee, the arrival of a small army at her word without her saying a single word. Dell's face had not once curdled into rage. There was no fury in her. And if you understood anything at all about what you were looking at, that absence of anger was the most terrifying thing in the entire building. Angry people are unpredictable. Angry people can be talked down. But a calm person who holds all the power in the room and feels no need to raise their voice, that is a person who has already decided exactly what is going to happen and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Dell reached down, slowly, and she set what was left of her coffee cup upright on the table, a small, deliberate act of order in the middle of all that stillness. She straightened her vest, and then she stepped out of the booth, fully, to her feet. The whole room seemed to lean back an inch. She wasn't tall. Standing, she was smaller than Trace by a head, but nobody in that diner was measuring height anymore. She stood there in the sudden hush, 30 years and a crew and a rainy Tuesday standing with her, and then she began to walk toward him, slow, unhurried. Those same deliberate steps she took everywhere, closing the space between them one measured footfall at a time. Trace couldn't move, couldn't speak. He watched her come, this quiet old woman who had turned out to be the most dangerous person he'd ever meet, and every certainty he'd walked in with lay in pieces on the coffee-wet floor. She stopped directly in front of him. She looked up into his face, and what she did next was the last thing anyone in that room expected. She lifted her hand. The whole room tensed for it, Trace most of all. He flinched, this trained champion, this young man who had never once backed down from a fight, because every instinct he had was screaming that the blow was finally coming and that he had earned it, and that there was nothing on earth he could do to stop it. But her hand didn't strike. It came to rest on his shoulder, gently, the same way she had rested a hand on Corrine's shoulder a lifetime ago, 30 minutes and 30 years earlier, in a booth by the window. And then Dell said the sentence. The one sentence. The words that had been waiting since the very beginning of this story, the ones that turned everything. "You're not angry at me, son," she said quietly. "You're just scared, and that's all right." And something in the room broke open, because it was true. It was so obviously, nakedly true that it went through Trace like a blade through paper. Nobody had ever said it to him. Not once in 23 years had anyone looked at all his strength and all his shouting and all his trophies and seen the frightened boy underneath, the one who'd built a fortress of muscle around a hole where his father should have been. He'd spent his whole life making sure no one would ever see it. And this woman had seen it in a single morning, across a diner, while he was gripping her arm and calling her worthless. "I know who you are," Dell went on, still quiet, still gentle, her voice pitched for him and him alone even in that silent, crowded room. "I knew your father. I rode a long way for him once, on a bad night, a long time ago. He was scared too. Most brave men are. That's what nobody tells you." She paused. "He didn't leave because you weren't enough. Whatever your mother's carried, whatever you told yourself, that wasn't it. You hear me?" Trace's jaw was working. His eyes had gone bright and wet, and he was fighting it with everything he had, the way he fought everything. And for the first time in his life, he was losing that fight in front of a room full of people and finding that the world didn't end when he did. Real strength isn't this. She glanced, just barely, at his hands, those trained, dangerous hands that had grabbed her arm. Any frightened person can throw a punch. I've watched hard men do terrible things their whole lives because they were too scared to do the harder thing. The harder thing is to stand in a room like this, with every reason to swing, and put your hand down. The harder thing is to let somebody see you. You want to prove you're strong. Her hand tightened on his shoulder, once, almost tender. "Go home and let your mother see you. That's the bravest thing you'll do all year." And here is the part that no one in that diner ever forgot. She could have destroyed him. Everyone understood that now. Trace most of all. She held a room, a crew, a whole standing army of consequence, one word away. He had put his hands on her in front of all of them. Every code those men lived by said something should happen now, and every one of them was waiting for the smallest signal to make it happen. And Dell gave no signal. She spent the most power a person can hold on the one thing power almost never buys: mercy. She looked at the young man who had spent the morning trying to break her, and instead of breaking him back, she reached down into the fear at the bottom of him and, gently, set it free. That's the twist this whole story was built toward. Not the crew, not the reveal. The moment the most dangerous person in the room turned out to be the kindest, and proved it when it cost her the most to prove. Trace's face crumpled. The armor came off all at once, the way it does when it finally goes. And this big, strong young champion put a hand over his eyes in a diner full of strangers and started, quietly, to come apart. Not from fear anymore. From relief. From the unbearable mercy of being seen and forgiven in the same breath. If you believe strength means knowing when not to swing, comment, real strength. The bullies of the world will never understand that. Let's drown them out. And Corinne, behind him, had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely now, watching a stranger give her son in 90 seconds the one thing she'd spent 23 years praying someone would. The crew along the walls didn't move. Dell kept her hand on the boy's shoulder and waited and let him cry. For a long moment, nobody in that diner did anything at all. They just let him cry. A room full of the hardest people you could imagine, and not one of them looked away, and not one of them smirked, and not one of them said a word to shame him for it. Because every man along those walls had, at some point in his own life, been exactly where that boy was standing now, cracked open, undefended, finally out of places to hide. They knew what it cost, and so they gave him the one courtesy that costs nothing and means everything. They let him have his moment without making him pay for it. It came out of Trace in stages. First it was just the tears, silent, the hand over the eyes. Then it was the shame. You could see it move across him, the full weight of the morning landing all at once. He looked at the coffee still dripping off the table's edge onto the floor. He looked at the arm he had grabbed, and at the woman it belonged to, and the understanding of what he had done, of who he had done it to, of how close he had come, hit him and buckled something in his chest. "I'm sorry," he managed, and his voice was nothing like the voice he'd walked in with. It was young. It was small. It was, maybe, the first honest thing he'd said out loud in years. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know anything." "I know you didn't," Dell said. And then he looked at his mother. That was the moment that broke the room the rest of the way. He turned and he looked at Corinne, at her wet face, at her hands still pressed to her mouth, at all the years of quiet grief she'd carried so that he wouldn't have to, and something passed between them that had been blocked for a very long time. He crossed the little space to her, and he put his arms around her, this big, strong young man folding down around his mother, and she held on to him like she'd been waiting her whole life to be allowed to, and the two of them stood there in the middle of that diner and wept for the man who wasn't there and the years they'd spent not talking about him. Dell watched them for a moment, and then she did the thing that closed the circle. She didn't lecture him further. She didn't extract a promise or make him grovel or hold the morning over his head, though she'd earned the right to do all three. She simply reached out when he finally lifted his head, and she did for Trace exactly what she had done for his mother an hour before and for a frightened diner owner on a rainy Tuesday years before that. She offered kindness, freely, asking nothing. "Sit down," she said gently, nodding at the booth. "Both of you, have some breakfast. On me." A flicker of something almost like a smile. "Well, on the house, apparently. They won't let me pay either way." And the waitress, wiping her own eyes now, actually laughed, a wet, grateful little laugh, and went for the coffee pot. That's the shape of the whole story, if you step back and look at it. Kindness given to a stranger. Kindness tested, cruelly, by someone who mistook it for weakness. And then, at the moment it would have been easiest and most justified to answer cruelty with force, kindness again. The same open hand, extended a third time, to the very person who had tried hardest to bite it. Because that was the thing Trace finally understood, sitting back down in that booth across from the woman he'd called old lady. Her gentleness had never been weakness. It had never once been weakness. It was the opposite. It was the hardest, most disciplined strength there is. The strength of a person who has every capacity for violence and chooses, again and again, not to use it. Anybody can be kind when they're powerless. It costs nothing. But to hold real power, the kind that arrives on a wall of engines at a single glance toward a door, and to answer an insult with mercy instead, that is a strength that no trophy on any wall could ever measure. He would carry that the rest of his life. You could see it settling into him even then, changing the set of his shoulders, softening something that had been clenched for 23 years. And the men along the walls, seeing that it was finished, seeing that their leader had handled it the way she handled everything, which is to say better than any of them could have, began, quietly, to file back out toward their bikes. The morning wasn't over yet, but the storm had passed. By the time the last engine faded down the highway, The diner was quiet again. It was almost strange how quickly it settled. The coffee got mopped up. A fresh cup appeared. Outside, a light rain had started to come down against the windows. The same soft gray weather that seems to follow the important days, and the neon sign buzzed against it the way it always had. If you'd walked in right then, off the highway, you'd have seen nothing at all. Just a warm little diner on a rainy morning. An old woman in a booth facing the door, a mother and son sharing breakfast a few tables over. You'd never have guessed. You never do. That was the whole point of her. But everything had changed, even if the room looked the same. Trace was different. You could see it in how he sat, quieter, closer to his mother, listening instead of performing. And before they left, he did something. He got up, and he walked over to Dell's booth, and he stood there a moment, unsure, the way you stand when the words are bigger than you know how to say. And then he took out his wallet and set some money on her table. Not to pay her back. You can't pay that kind of thing back, and he knew it. It was something else. It was a young man who had spent his whole life learning, for the first time, how to give. For the next person who comes in crying, he said, whoever they are, cover it. Don't tell them who. Her own words. Handed back to her. And Dell looked at that money for a long moment. And then she looked up at the boy, and for the first time all morning something in her face went soft and unguarded and almost proud. That, she said, is the strongest thing you've done all year. And that answers the last of it. The little things from that first quiet morning, you understand them all now. The waitress who would never take her money. A daughter honoring a debt her mother could never repay. The trucker's nod and lowered eyes. Respect, the kind you give in a church. And the phone that buzzed once and was silenced without a glance. That was the crew, checking in, the way they always did, the way they always would, one word away and waiting. She'd silenced it that morning because there was no need yet. She would glance at the door, hours later, and there would be. She had built her whole life out of one simple thing, repeated until it became who she was. She had been the frightened one, once, a long time ago, before the 30 years and the crew and the rainy Tuesday. Someone had shown her mercy when she'd expected a fist, and she had spent the rest of her life paying it forward to every crying stranger and every scared young man she ever came across, because she knew, better than anyone in that diner, that the thing that saves people isn't power. It's kindness, offered by someone who had every reason not to. The rain came down. The coffee steamed. And in a quiet diner off an ordinary highway, the strongest woman for 3 states finished her breakfast, left too much money on the table, and went out into the morning. So that's the story of the black belt who demanded a fight, and the quiet old woman who turned out to be the last person on earth he should have challenged. But if you remember one thing from all of this, let it be the thing that Trace learned the hard way, in front of a room full of witnesses, on an ordinary morning that he would carry for the rest of his life. Kindness is not weakness. It never was. The gentlest person in the room is very often the strongest, not because they can't fight, but because they've chosen, again and again, not to. Anyone can be cruel. Cruelty is easy. Cruelty is what fear does when it runs out of other ideas. But to hold real power in your hands, the kind that arrives on a wall of thunder at a single glance toward a door, and to answer an insult with mercy instead of a fist, that is a strength most people will never understand and never possess. Dell understood it. She'd been on both sides of it, and she spent her whole life proving that the softest thing in the room and the most dangerous thing in the room can be the very same person. The world is full of people who mistake kindness for weakness. And people who know better. If you're the second kind, subscribe and stay. There's another story like this one waiting for you, and the people who prey on the gentle, they're not welcome here. So be the one who covers the stranger's breakfast. Be the one who puts the hand down. It's the strongest thing you'll ever do.